The sound of Rusty's terrified yelps echoing from inside the industrial trash compactor still haunts my nightmares. I watched in horror as 7-year-old Orion screamed, "No!" while Serafina slammed the metal door shut and hit the activation button. The mechanical grinding started immediately, and blood began seeping from the bottom of the unit onto the pristine concrete. My son's therapy dog, the only thing that helped him sleep since his mother's death, was being crushed alive while this woman smiled with satisfaction. "That's what happens to strays in my neighborhood," she snarled, wiping dog blood off her manicured fingers. What Serafina didn't know was that I wasn't just another single dad trying to raise his traumatized kid. She had no idea I was a Homeland Security investigator who'd been tracking her money laundering operation for 8 months, and in exactly 3 minutes. Federal agents would freeze every asset she owned while SWAT teams surrounded her mansion. Before I tell you how a community trash compactor became the center of a federal terrorism investigation, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I need to see how far this story reaches. Hit that subscribe button because what happened next exposed one of the largest HOA corruption schemes in U.S. history, and every family needs to know these warning signs. My name is Daxton, and 3 years ago, I thought the worst thing that could happen to my family already had. My wife Elena was murdered during a home invasion while 7-year-old Orion hid in his bedroom closet, listening to her screams through the thin walls. The trauma shattered my son's ability to speak to anyone except me, and even then, his words came in whispers that barely carried across a room. Sleep became impossible for him. Loud noises triggered panic attacks that would last for hours. Simple activities like grocery shopping or visiting playgrounds became elaborate productions requiring careful planning and multiple escape routes. That's when our family therapist recommended Rusty, a 4-year-old golden retriever who'd been specifically trained to work with children suffering from severe anxiety and post-traumatic stress. The bond between Orion and Rusty was immediate and profound. Within weeks of Rusty's arrival, my son began sleeping through the night for the first time since Elena's death. The dog seemed to understand exactly when Orion needed comfort, pressing his warm body against my son's legs during difficult moments, or gently nudging him toward activities that would help rebuild his confidence. Our daily routine became structured around Orion's healing process. Every morning at 6 a.m., before the neighborhood stirred to life, Orion and Rusty would walk the winding trails that connected Willowbrook Heights to the adjacent nature preserve. These early morning expeditions were sacred time for both of them, allowing Orion to practice basic social interactions with the few joggers and dog walkers they encountered, while Rusty provided the security blanket that made such encounters possible. The golden retriever wore his therapy dog certification vest with obvious pride, tail wagging as children pointed and adults smiled approvingly at his important work. What none of our neighbors knew was the true nature of my professional life. To everyone in Willowbrook Heights, I was simply Daxton, the work-from-home cybersecurity consultant who'd moved to their upscale community seeking a fresh start after personal tragedy. I deliberately cultivated this unremarkable image, mentioning vague details about computer systems and government contracts when pressed for specifics about my career. The reality was far more complex and classified than suburban small talk could accommodate. I'm a senior investigator with the Department of Homeland Security's Financial Crimes Division, specializing in tracking terrorist financing through legitimate business fronts. My current assignment involved infiltrating and documenting a sophisticated money laundering network that used homeowner association management companies to funnel millions of dollars to overseas extremist organizations. The investigation, codenamed Operation Clean House, had identified 73 upscale communities across 5 states whose HOA fees were being systematically skimmed and redirected through shell companies with connections to known terrorist cells. The irony of living in Willowbrook Heights while investigating HOA corruption wasn't lost on me. But the neighborhood's management company, Prestige Community Holdings, had appeared on our radar as a potential front operation worth extensive surveillance. What I hadn't anticipated was how personally invested the investigation would become when our own HOA president emerged as a key figure in the network we'd been tracking for over 2 years. Serafina Blackwood ruled Willowbrook Heights with the iron fist of someone who'd clawed her way out of childhood poverty and would never allow anything to threaten her carefully constructed empire of respectability. She lived in the neighborhood's crown jewel, a $3.2 million estate positioned on the highest corner lot with sweeping views of the valley below. Her mansion served as unofficial headquarters for the HOA, hosting monthly board meetings in her marble foyer, while residents waited nervously in designer furniture arrangements that cost more than most people's annual salaries. My background research on Serafina had uncovered a fascinating transformation from her origins in rural Kentucky trailer parks to her current status as a pillar of suburban society. She'd worked as an international banker for 15 years before retiring early, under circumstances that remained mysteriously vague in all official documents. Her financial disclosures showed impossible wealth accumulation that didn't match her reported banking salary, suggesting income sources that hadn't been properly documented or taxed. Most intriguingly, her retirement coincided exactly with the founding of Prestige Community Holdings and her immediate assumption of HOA leadership in multiple communities. The first signs of trouble appeared during our second week in Willowbrook Heights, when I found an anonymous complaint slipped under our door during the night. The typed letter, printed on official HOA letterhead, but lacking any signature or identification, alleged that residents had reported an unleashed dog creating disturbances during inappropriate hours. The accusation was completely fabricated since Rusty never left Orion's side and was always properly leashed during their morning walks. More troubling was the letter's threatening tone, demanding immediate compliance with unspecified regulations or face escalating penalties that could result in forced relocation. I initially dismissed the complaint as a misunderstanding, perhaps from someone who didn't understand federal protections for therapy animals or the specific needs of traumatized children. Orion had been making such remarkable progress since our move to Willowbrook Heights that I was reluctant to create conflict that might disrupt his healing process. The neighborhood's quiet streets and well-maintained walking trails provided exactly the kind of controlled environment where he could practice rebuilding his confidence in small, manageable steps. My optimistic assessment proved naive when the complaints escalated rapidly over the following days. A formal fine notice arrived via certified mail, demanding $500 for disturbing community peace during restricted hours and failure to register therapeutic animal with appropriate authorities. The letter cited specific HOA bylaws that I'd never seen in our original documentation, suggesting either a recent policy change or the existence of hidden regulations that weren't disclosed to new residents during the purchase process. The financial penalty was manageable, but the psychological impact on Orion was immediate and devastating. He'd overheard me discussing the complaint with our real estate agent and became convinced that Rusty was in trouble because of something he'd done wrong. His carefully rebuilt confidence crumbled as he whispered tearful apologies to his therapy dog, promising to be quieter and more careful during their morning walks. The regression was heartbreaking to witness, undoing months of therapeutic progress in a matter of days. That evening, I made my first official report to Homeland Security headquarters, logging the harassment as potential targeting of a federal agent family. The incident was documented and flagged for monitoring, but I hoped the situation wouldn't require escalation to active investigation status. My primary concern remained Orion's healing process, and I was willing to absorb considerable personal inconvenience to avoid disrupting the stable environment he desperately needed. The harassment intensified during our third week when additional complaints began arriving daily, each more creative and vindictive than the last. Anonymous letters accused us of housing an aggressive animal that threatened community safety, demanded psychiatric evaluations for both Orion and Rusty, and threatened to involve animal control authorities in removing what they termed an unlicensed therapeutic fraud. The language grew increasingly personal and cruel, targeting Orion's selective mutism and suggesting that his trauma was evidence of inadequate parenting that endangered other neighborhood children. More disturbing was the realization that someone was conducting systematic surveillance of our daily activities. The complaints included specific details about our morning walk routes, exact times when Orion practiced verbal exercises with Rusty, and accurate descriptions of therapeutic activities that should have been private family moments. Someone was watching us closely enough to document intimate details of a traumatized child's recovery process, then weaponizing that information in harassment campaigns designed to drive us away from the community. I began noticing Serafina's presence during our morning walks, always positioned at strategic locations where she could observe while maintaining plausible deniability about her surveillance activities. She'd appear on her mansion's second-floor balcony with binoculars and a notepad, documenting everything Orion and Rusty did during their therapeutic exercises. When I tried to approach her directly about the complaints, she'd suddenly become very busy with her paperwork, retreating inside while muttering about community standards and property value protection. The psychological warfare escalated when Serafina began following us during our neighborhood walks, maintaining a distance of about 50 yards while filming everything with her smartphone. She'd speak loudly into Bluetooth headsets about gathering evidence and documenting violations, ensuring that Orion could hear every word despite her apparent attempts at discretion. The constant surveillance transformed our peaceful morning routine into a gauntlet of anxiety and hypervigilance that triggered memories of the home invasion trauma Orion had worked so hard to overcome. Other residents started avoiding us entirely, crossing streets when they saw us approaching, or suddenly finding urgent reasons to go inside when Orion appeared with Rusty. I learned through casual conversations that Serafina had been hosting impromptu meetings in her driveway, gathering small groups of neighbors to discuss what she termed the problem family that was threatening their community's reputation and property values. She'd apparently been spreading rumors about fraudulent disability claims and suggesting that Orion's therapy dog certification was somehow illegitimate or dangerous. The isolation was systematic and effective, turning neighbors who might have been natural allies into unwitting participants in a harassment campaign that grew more sophisticated each day. Serafina understood exactly how to manipulate community dynamics, presenting herself as a protective leader while portraying us as outside threats that required coordinated response. Her approach was psychological warfare disguised as civic responsibility, and it was devastatingly effective at destroying the safe environment Orion needed for continued healing. The situation reached a new level of cruelty when Child Protective Services appeared at our door on a Thursday afternoon, responding to anonymous reports of child neglect and potential animal abuse. The caseworker, a kind woman named Patricia, who seemed genuinely apologetic about the visit, explained that someone had filed detailed complaints alleging that Orion was being denied proper psychiatric care and that Rusty was actually an untrained pet being used to manipulate public sympathy for fraudulent purposes. Patricia spent 3 hours interviewing Orion, examining Rusty's extensive documentation, and reviewing medical records that clearly established both the legitimacy of my son's trauma and the therapy dog's professional training credentials. Her investigation was thorough and professional, but the experience was traumatic for Orion, who became convinced that government officials were planning to separate him from both Rusty and me. The false accusations were sophisticated enough to require detailed investigation, suggesting that whoever filed the report had researched exactly which claims would trigger mandatory child welfare investigations. Whoever called this in knew exactly which buttons to push, Patricia confided as she prepared to leave. The allegations were specific enough to require follow-up, but obviously fabricated by someone with no actual knowledge of your family situation. Your son is clearly well cared for, and that dog is definitely a legitimate service animal. I'm sorry you had to deal with this harassment disguised as concern for child welfare. That night, I held Orion while he cried himself to sleep, terrified that social services would return to take Rusty away despite Patricia's reassurances. The golden retriever pressed against both of us. Sensing our distress and trying to provide comfort through his warm presence and steady breathing, I made a decision that evening that would change everything. I activated my federal security protocols, officially designating our family as being under potential domestic threat from what appeared to be systematic harassment with possible connections to the financial crimes network I'd been investigating. The escalation continued when Serafina hired what she claimed was a professional dog behavioral specialist to evaluate Rusty's temperament and training credentials. The man who appeared at our door introduced himself as Dr. Morrison. Presenting official-looking credentials and demanding immediate access to conduct what he termed a community safety assessment of our therapy dog. His aggressive demeanor and lack of proper identification immediately raised red flags. But his presence demonstrated how far Serafina was willing to go in her harassment campaign. I refused to allow the unauthorized evaluation, citing federal protections for therapy animals and demanding to see legitimate credentials from recognized certification bodies. Dr. Morrison became increasingly hostile when I challenged his authority, eventually threatening to have Rusty confiscated as an aggressive animal presenting community danger if I didn't cooperate with his assessment. The entire encounter was clearly orchestrated to create a pretext for removing Rusty from our home. But the sophistication of the scheme suggested resources and connections that went far beyond typical HOA disputes. My investigation into Dr. Morrison revealed that he wasn't a legitimate animal behaviorist, but rather a private investigator with a history of harassment campaigns targeting individuals and families at the request of paying clients. His fake credentials were elaborate and convincing, suggesting significant investment in creating believable false documentation. The fact that Serafina had hired professional help to target my traumatized son and his therapy dog revealed a level of malice that went far beyond community standards enforcement. During our 4th week in Willowbrook Heights, the harassment reached its crescendo when Serafina began direct confrontations designed to trigger Orion's trauma responses in public settings. She'd appear at the community playground whenever we arrived, loudly discussing dangerous mentally ill children and aggressive animals while positioned close enough for Orion to hear every word. Her timing was precise and deliberate, suggesting continued surveillance of our daily routines and careful planning to maximize psychological impact. The worst incident occurred when Serafina cornered us near the playground's sandbox, screaming about property values and disturbed children who threatened community safety. She demanded that I provide Orion's complete psychiatric records and threatened to have Rusty euthanized as an aggressive animal if we didn't immediately relocate to a more appropriate neighborhood for families with special needs. Her voice carried across the entire playground, ensuring that other children and parents witnessed her verbal assault on my traumatized son. Orion suffered his first panic attack in months during Serafina's tirade, hyperventilating and shaking, while Rusty tried desperately to provide comfort through his trained calming techniques. The golden retriever positioned himself between Orion and Serafina, not aggressively, but protectively, creating a physical barrier while using his body weight to ground my son during the anxiety episode. Other parents gathered their children and left the playground rather than intervene, leaving us isolated with our tormentor, who seemed energized by the distress she was causing. "I have connections in animal control and social services," she declared as Orion slowly recovered from his panic attack. people who understand the difference between legitimate needs and fraudulent manipulation of public sympathy. Your little performance isn't fooling anyone, and I guarantee that mutt will be gone within the week. The threat was specific and credible, delivered by someone who'd already demonstrated her willingness to weaponize government agencies against our family. That evening, I finally dropped my cover story and issued a direct warning to Serafina. You're making a serious mistake. I told her quietly during a chance encounter at the community mailboxes. I work with federal compliance issues, and what you're doing could have consequences you haven't considered. I kept my language deliberately vague, but the implication was clear enough that someone with legitimate reasons to fear federal investigation might reconsider their behavior instead of backing down. Serafina seemed energized by what she interpreted as confirmation that we were somehow involved in government fraud schemes. Her harassment intensified as she apparently convinced herself that exposing our illegal activities would justify her increasingly extreme tactics. She began researching federal disability fraud cases, gathering ammunition for what she clearly intended as a comprehensive campaign to destroy our family's credibility and force our relocation. The breaking point came on a Saturday morning that started exactly like dozens of others. Orion wheeled himself out of bed at 6 a.m., quietly dressed in his favorite dinosaur t-shirt, and attached Rusty's leash for their daily therapeutic walk through the neighborhood trails. The golden retriever wagged his tail with the patient enthusiasm that made him such an effective therapy animal, ready for another day of helping his young partner navigate the world with gradually increasing confidence. I watched from the kitchen window as they headed toward the newer section of Willowbrook Heights, where recent construction had added luxury amenities, including a state-of-the-art waste management facility designed to handle large-scale landscaping debris and community maintenance projects. The industrial trash compactor was housed in a modern concrete structure that looked more like a small warehouse than a typical garbage facility, complete with electronic controls and safety systems that required special access codes to operate. What I didn't know was that Serafina had been planning this morning's confrontation for days, coordinating with the facilities manager to ensure she'd have access to equipment that could serve her twisted purposes. She'd apparently decided that since legal harassment hadn't driven us away, more direct action was required to eliminate what she saw as a threat to her perfect community. The call came at 6:15 a.m. Orion's voice breaking through my phone's speaker in a way that immediately triggered every parental alarm I possessed. "Dad, she's here and she's really angry." His whisper carried pure terror, the same tone he'd used when hiding in his closet during his mother's murder. "She's saying things about Rusty and she has something in her hands." I grabbed my keys and sprinted toward the waste management facility, my heart hammering with the certainty that Serafina had finally crossed a line from harassment into something far more dangerous. The morning air carried sounds that didn't belong in our peaceful neighborhood, raised voices, mechanical humming, and underneath it all, a golden retriever's confused whine as he tried to understand why a human was radiating such hostile energy. What I found when I arrived would haunt both Orion and me for the rest of our lives. But it would also trigger a federal investigation that would expose one of the most sophisticated terrorism financing networks ever discovered on American soil. Serafina had finally made the mistake that would bring her entire criminal empire crashing down. But first, she was going to try to murder my son's therapy dog in the most brutal way imaginable. The industrial compactor was running when I rounded the corner, its mechanical grinding filling the air with the sound of crushing metal and concrete debris. But mixed in with those expected noises was something that made my blood freeze, the terrified yelping of a dog in mortal danger, echoing from inside the machine that was designed to crush construction waste into manageable cubes. Serafina stood beside the massive industrial compactor with blood on her designer blouse and satisfaction gleaming in her eyes. She held the control panel remote in her manicured hands like some kind of twisted trophy, watching the machine crush whatever was trapped inside while Orion sobbed hysterically 20 feet away. "That's what happens to strays in my neighborhood," she declared, wiping dog blood off her fingers with a lace handkerchief. Problem solved. I lunged for the emergency stop button, frantically hammering the red switch until the grinding machinery shuddered to a halt. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by Orion's terrified sobs and a weak whimpering sound from inside the compactor that made my heart nearly stop. Rusty was alive. But barely. And every second counted if I was going to save the therapy dog who'd become my son's lifeline to healing. "You can't stop community maintenance," Serafina snapped, moving to block my access to the compactor's release mechanism. "That animal was creating a public nuisance, and I have every right to dispose of stray pets that threaten property values." Her words were sharp and confident, delivered by someone who'd clearly convinced herself that attempted murder was justified by HOA regulations and community standards. I shoved past her with enough force to send her stumbling backward in her expensive heels, my federal training taking over as I assessed the mechanical systems and emergency overrides built into the industrial equipment. The compactor's safety features were designed to prevent exactly this kind of situation, but Serafina had somehow bypassed multiple fail-safes to trap Rusty inside the crushing chamber. Her familiarity with the equipment suggested extensive planning and coordination with facilities personnel who should never have granted her access to dangerous machinery. The metal door was jammed partially closed, creating just enough space for me to see Rusty's golden fur matted with blood as he lay motionless in the corner of the crushing chamber. His breathing was shallow and labored, indicating serious internal injuries from the brief time the compactor had been operational. A pool of bright red blood was spreading beneath him, and his left hind leg was bent at an unnatural angle that suggested multiple fractures. "Rusty." Orion's voice cracked as he wheeled his chair as close to the compactor as possible, reaching desperately toward his therapy dog. "Please don't die. Please don't leave me." The raw terror in my son's words was heartbreaking, echoing the same helpless panic he'd experienced during his mother's murder. For the first time in months, he was speaking in full sentences, but only because his emotional support system was dying in front of him. I managed to pry the compactor door open enough to crawl inside, carefully lifting Rusty's broken body while trying not to cause additional damage to his internal organs. The golden retriever's eyes fluttered open as I touched him, his tail managing one weak wag despite the agony he was enduring, even critically injured and facing death. Rusty's first instinct was to comfort the humans he'd been trained to protect and serve. Emergency veterinary services. I called 911 while cradling Rusty against my chest, feeling his labored breathing and the sticky warmth of blood soaking through my shirt. Golden retriever, severe crush injuries, possible internal bleeding, need immediate transport to trauma facility. The dispatcher promised rapid response, but I knew that every minute counted when dealing with injuries this severe. Then I made the second call that would change everything, dialing a classified number that very few people have access to. "This is Agent ID Sierra 92 Charlie," I said quietly, walking far enough from Serafina that she couldn't hear the specific details. "Requesting immediate asset freeze on target Serafina Blackwood, also known as Sarah Pemberton, CEO of Prestige Community Holdings. Personal attack on federal agent family. Activate Operation Cleanhouse protocols immediately." The voice on the other end was crisp and professional. Confirmed. Sierra 92. Charlie. Operation Cleanhouse activation authorized. All units mobilizing for full spectrum response. Estimated arrival time 3 minutes. Maintain position and continue documentation. Serafina's confidence began wavering as she noticed my calm efficiency in handling what she'd intended as complete chaos. "What kind of cybersecurity consultant talks like that?" she demanded, her voice rising with the first hints of genuine concern. "Who exactly are you calling?" But she was too focused on defending her actions to fully process the implications of federal terminology and response protocols that no civilian should know. The emergency veterinary team arrived first, paramedics immediately taking charge of Rusty's care while stabilizing him for transport to the nearest animal trauma center. They confirmed my worst fears: severe internal injuries, multiple broken ribs, possible organ damage, and significant blood loss that required immediate surgical intervention. The golden retriever was fighting for his life, and there was no guarantee that even the best medical care could save him. "Will he be okay?" Orion whispered, as they loaded Rusty into the specialized ambulance, his small voice carrying all the fear and desperation of a child who'd already lost too much. I held his hand while we watched his therapy dog disappear behind closing doors, neither of us knowing if we'd ever see Rusty alive again. That's when the first black SUV appeared at the entrance to the waste management facility. Then came the second, and the third. Federal agents in tactical gear began deploying with military precision, surrounding not just the immediate area, but establishing a security perimeter that encompassed Serafina's mansion and key access points throughout the neighborhood. Homeland Security vehicles were followed by FBI units, Treasury agents, and specialized teams whose specific roles were classified above my clearance level. Serafina's face went white as she realized that something far beyond local law enforcement was responding to what she'd dismissed as a neighborhood dispute. "This is ridiculous," she sputtered, backing away from the advancing federal agents. "I'm the HOA president. You can't just invade private property over a stray dog incident." Agent Richardson, the lead investigator I'd been coordinating with for 8 months, approached with his badge clearly visible and the calm, professional demeanor of someone accustomed to high-stakes operations. "Ms. Blackwood, I'm Agent Richardson with the Department of Homeland Security Financial Crimes Division. You've just committed assault against the family of a federal agent conducting an ongoing terrorism investigation. We're here to secure evidence and begin immediate prosecution of related federal crimes." The blood drained from Serafina's face as she processed the implications of terrorism investigations and federal agent families. For the first time since I'd known her, she looked genuinely terrified instead of merely angry. Terrorism. That's impossible. I run community associations. I protect property values. But her protests rang hollow as more federal vehicles arrived and agents began implementing what was clearly a pre-planned operation. "Ma'am, you're the CEO of Prestige Community Holdings, which we've identified as a front operation for laundering money to overseas terrorist organizations." Agent Richardson continued as additional agents began securing her mansion and seizing electronic equipment. "Your HOA management fees have been funding extremist networks for over 3 years. The attack on Agent Daxton's family was the final piece of evidence we needed to activate full prosecution protocols." Serafina's legs nearly buckled as the scope of her exposure became clear. "I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered, but her panic was evident as agents emerged from her house carrying computers, financial documents, and what appeared to be sophisticated communication and equipment that no HOA president should possess. Agent Richardson held up a tablet displaying financial records that clearly showed Serafina's dual identity and the money laundering network she'd been operating through multiple shell companies: Sarah Pemberton, Serafina Blackwood, and 6 other aliases connected to Prestige Community Holdings, he explained. Bank records show $47 million in suspicious international transfers over the past 4 years, with direct connections to known terrorist financing networks. The evidence was overwhelming and meticulously documented, revealing how Serafina had used her HOA management empire to skim money from community fees and funnel it through offshore accounts to extremist organizations. Her obsession with controlling neighborhood demographics wasn't just personal pathology. It was part of a larger operation designed to maintain the perfect cover for international money laundering while eliminating anyone who might accidentally discover her criminal activities. The chemical attack on the therapy dog triggered our national security protocols. Agent Richardson continued as Serafina was handcuffed beside the same trash compactor where she'd tried to murder Rusty. Assault on a federal agent's family, terrorism financing, money laundering, conspiracy against the United States, and now animal cruelty with a deadly weapon. You're looking at multiple life sentences in federal prison. Orion watched the arrest with wide eyes, processing the revelation that his father's real job involved catching terrorists and that the woman who'd terrorized them was part of something much more dangerous than HOA disputes. "Dad," he whispered, speaking more clearly than he had since his mother's death. "You catch bad people who hurt kids and dogs." I knelt beside his wheelchair, realizing that my son was finally beginning to understand that there were adults in the world whose duty was to protect innocent people from the kind of evil that had taken his mother's life. "That's exactly what I do," I confirmed. "And now the bad people can't hurt anyone else." The next 6 hours were a blur of emergency surgery updates, federal debriefings, and media attention as news broke about the terrorism financing network that had been operating through suburban HOA management. Rusty survived his surgery, though he'd lost significant mobility in his left hind leg and would require months of rehabilitation. The veterinary team called his survival miraculous, considering the severity of his crush injuries and blood loss. More importantly, Orion found his voice during those crucial hours, speaking clearly and confidently as he provided testimony that helped federal investigators understand the full scope of Serafina's harassment campaign. His brave recounting of events demonstrated remarkable emotional growth and healing, suggesting that surviving this traumatic experience together had actually strengthened his recovery process rather than derailing it. The community transformation that followed was swift and comprehensive. With Prestige Community Holdings dissolved and its assets seized, Willowbrook Heights hired legitimate management that focused on actual community improvement rather than harassment and money laundering. Neighbors who had once feared Serafina's retaliation came forward with their own stories of intimidation and abuse, revealing a pattern of systematic targeting that had affected dozens of families. Serafina received 47 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to terrorism financing, money laundering, conspiracy against the United States, and assault on a federal agent's family. Her mansion and luxury vehicles were seized to pay restitution to victims of her various schemes, including a substantial settlement that funded Rusty's ongoing medical care and Orion's continued therapy. 6 months later, Orion testified before a congressional committee investigating HOA corruption and its connections to domestic terrorism financing, with Rusty sitting proudly beside his wheelchair, wearing a special harness designed to accommodate his partially paralyzed leg. My son spoke eloquently about the importance of protecting therapy animals and the courage required to stand up against adult bullies who target vulnerable children. "Rusty taught me that being scared doesn't mean you're weak," Orion told the assembled congressman, his voice clear and confident in a way that would have been impossible before our ordeal. "It means you're brave enough to keep going, even when bad people try to stop you." His testimony helped pass legislation creating federal criminal penalties for interfering with service animals and establishing oversight mechanisms for community management companies. The seized assets from Serafina's criminal network funded the creation of a therapy dog training center in our community, providing free assistance animals to traumatized children and veterans throughout the region. Orion volunteered there every weekend, working with trainers to help match dogs with families who needed them while Rusty served as a living example of resilience and the unbreakable bond between healing hearts. Serafina's final act of cruelty had backfired spectacularly, triggering consequences that destroyed her terrorist financing network, exposed international money laundering schemes, and ultimately created positive changes that would help countless families for years to come. Her attempt to murder my son's therapy dog had instead revealed her true identity and brought down one of the most sophisticated terrorism financing operations ever discovered on American soil. Sometimes justice moves slowly through proper channels, but when it finally arrives with the full force of federal law enforcement, it can be swift and absolute. Serafina learned too late that real power doesn't come from intimidation, money laundering, or attempted murder. It comes from protecting the innocent, serving others, and standing up for what's right, even when the personal cost seems overwhelming. Rusty's partially paralyzed but still devoted presence reminded us daily that true strength isn't about being perfect or powerful. It's about adapting, serving, and loving unconditionally, no matter what challenges life brings. In the end, a 7-year-old boy and his courageous therapy dog had accomplished what federal investigators had been working toward for years: exposing terrorism, protecting vulnerable families, and proving that love conquers even the most sophisticated evil.